Thank you so much. I hope you had a good lunch and are ready for this session, which is going to be a really interesting one because we're talking about, hopefully, solutions to all of these issues that we've been covering over the last day and a half. Just want to set the scene, the dire scene that we're sort of facing at the moment, particularly in a region where I cover and live in the Horn of Africa. So generally, we're seeing that there have been more than 11,000 disasters due to weather, climate, and water-related hazards over the last 50 years. Extreme weather and climate-related hazards have also killed more than 410,000 people in the past decade alone. The vast majority of those people come from low and lower middle-income countries. So as we've heard throughout this conference and many other conferences, one of the ways to adapt to this increasingly difficult issue are through early warning systems. They are highly effective in dealing and adapting to climate change, of course, and building resilience to extreme weather. And they can save lives, but also they can save assets too. Earlier this year, the UN unveiled an ambitious target to have everyone on Earth protected by early warning systems against increasingly extreme weather and climate change. However, less than half of the World Meteorological Organization have early warning systems in place. And of course, as we've heard repeatedly here, these early warning systems are useless without early action. So for today's panel, I'm really privileged to say that we've gathered 4 experts to explore concrete ways in which a preparedness-based approach to climate risks can support climate resilience and build on peace approaches too. So we're going to discuss here the synergies, the gaps, the scope for collaboration, which is very important, and also we're going to look for concrete, on-the-ground approaches, and we really appreciate your input in that too. Just to introduce the illustrious guests that we have here speaking with us today, Johann Flasbard took office as State Secretary at the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development in December 2021. From 2013 to 2021, he was State Secretary at the Federal Ministry for the Environment, Nature, Conservation and Nuclear Safety. Prior to that, he held the position of President of the Federal Environment Agency for 4 years. Jennifer Morgan, as we all know, has been State Secretary and Special Envoy for International Climate Action at the Federal Foreign Office since March 2022. She's had an extensive career working on climate issues and previously held a position of Executive Director at Greenpeace and was a member of the German Council for Sustainability Development and Director of the Global Climate Program at World Resources Institute in DC, Washington, DC, and Berlin. Maha Yassin is a research fellow at the Klingendahl Institute. Her work focuses on awareness raising via policy research and outreach on climate security nexus in Iraq and the wider Middle East region. Maha manages the Basra Forum for Climate, Environment and Security, a network of local environment, climate and security actors in Iraq. And finally, Patrizia Danzi is the State Secretary and Director General of the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation. Danzi has extensive experience in development cooperation. She's worked for the ICRC since 1996 in Africa, South America, and the Balkans, and was appointed Deputy Head of the Horn of Africa Division in 2004. She's worked as a political advisor at the ICRC. In 2008, she took over as management of operations on the American continent. For the last 4 years, Patrizia has been Regional Director for Africa at the ICRC's headquarters in Geneva, and she took up her post at the SDC in 2020. Let's start with Maha, with her extensive in the field and on the ground experience. Maha, can you tell us why is it that early warning systems aren't really in place in many areas? And what evidence can you share, perhaps, from your extensive experience in the Middle East?
Yes, thank you, Nazanin, and also thank you for the Berlin Climate Security Conference for having us. I think it's quite challenging to cover the whole Middle East in 5 minutes, so I will zoom in on Iraq, where we also work there, and as a model case of a country that is severely affected by climate change and also an active state of conflict. I think Iraq has been suffering from a lot of internal conflict and also in the past external ones, and this has led to promoted the government to put a lot of effort and resources to prevent these kind of immediate threats on hard security. So while neglecting that, climate change is also adding another layer of instability to the region. And this is something that we see mostly in the southern part of the Iraq, where drought and desertification is a bigger problem. This is also due to the onset event of that is related to the climate change that do not necessarily make an early warning and early action a priority on the political agenda by Iraqi politicians. Another reason is, of course, there is little data and little technology invested in this region that is preventing early action. And also, I think the final and the most important point is the marginalization of local communities who hold a lot of knowledge that could be invested in setting up early warning systems. And this is something that we clearly see in the south of Iraq, where a lot of these actors from these communities were in clashes with other state or non-state actors because they were seen as a threat to security by raising their voices and demanding early action from the government. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maha. So we heard from Maha, the reasons are conflict, also it's not on the political agenda, lack of data, technology, marginalization, all of these really crucial, important issues. What do you think is hampering this global capacity to translate early warning into early action?
I mean, I think, first of all, I could just echo what you were saying. I mean, I think from what we're hearing, you're on the ground. I mean, I think in some cases there's not enough data, but even where there is a lot of data, it's not necessarily leading to action on the ground. I think sometimes there's silos that are built up, or there aren't kind of the policy guidelines that can move things across quickly. And so I think that's one of the issues, is that you have all this data, but it's not necessarily, what's the right word, applicable or context relevant or available to the communities on the ground necessarily. So there's almost like a gap between that where there is data available, and I think that's one of the key things. I think the other is, there's just different funding priorities and just the perennial challenge of mobilizing funding for prevention rather than cure. And also, I mean, the complexity of all of this, I think, also keeps the early warning, not just the early warning systems, but the entire early warning approach, I would say, oftentimes at bay. And because it's more, you need to actually have people either in the government or on the ground who can think across all of these issues. Another thought is just, I think what Germany is trying to do is around anticipatory action and an approach really trying to shift in the humanitarian system towards that. And the G7 is also moving in that direction, but that isn't necessarily the norm. So I think that's the other thing, is people are thinking about more, the immediate rather than putting in place much more of a systemic piece. So that's why I think some of the initiatives we've been talking to will come to those, but are trying to respond to those gaps that are there. Clearly also, financing, funding, but also what I see always very much as these global initiatives, but then the local contextual perspective, and then also sometimes national governments wanting to hold on to things and not necessarily let it go for local communities, civil society, et cetera, to be able to have access to it.
I mean, you mentioned that funding is obviously a big issue. It's an issue everywhere. But what kind of financial architecture is there to support better preparedness? Because that's what we're talking about, right? Better preparedness, risk management, early action, as you said, anticipatory action. What kind of architecture is out there to do that?
Well, I'll start, and then I'll hand it to my colleague Jochen, who is really the lead on this in the German government. But I think there's a couple of different parts of it, and I think that's part of the challenge, right? So there's the climate finance architecture, which you have where Germany is working to provide our fair share of trying to meet that 100 billion, which then goes into different pots or different funds, whether it be the adaptation fund, which I think is not very well connected in with actually conflict reduction and peace building. And I'm curious if there's a way of trying to do that, especially in fragile states more, to connect that. There's obviously those are kind of the climate funds. Then you have also humanitarian assistance and trying to do that through a more anticipatory action piece. And then, of course, and it's where I'll hand over to Jochen, is the entire development international financial infrastructure that's there, which I think a number are noting that right now it's not necessarily fit for purpose, particularly for fragile states, because the access to some of those funds is not working well. The amount of funding that's going into adaptation or peace building is not the focus. Climate is not fully mainstreamed across there. And then, of course, you have the whole IMF discussion and debt forgiveness, and so you have to kind of see that whole picture. And I think that's one of the things that we're trying to think about, is how to help countries navigate through that very complex financial architecture.
Yeah, and I think the fragile context is crucial for some of the regions that we're talking about, and we're going to come back to that later on. But I just wanted to come to you, Jochen, and ask you, about these kind of barriers and challenges. It's really important for us to look at some concrete examples now of what is working or what could potentially work to promote what we're talking about, which is this kind of preparedness for approaches to climate risks, because the stakes are so incredibly high.
Thanks a lot, and good to be here at this very important conference. Putting climate and security in one context, absolutely essential, and very nice to be here in the Weltsaal, which looks now a bit like a World Coffee. And well, with regard to your question and the topic of this session on the Global Shield, I think to look at the overall picture, we have different pillars, and still I insist that pillar one is mitigation. We need to keep this world on track for 1.5. And then it comes to adaptation, which is needed to protect the people against what is happening with climate through climate change. And the third one is then loss and damage. It's maybe the rest, which is a residual from our failure from mitigation and adaptation, something that still exists. And early warning systems, in a way, are sitting between adaptation and loss and damage. So, and with loss and damage, as you said, what has been done, I mean, it's not that we haven't done anything. There is something on the way already. But in the past, when we started in Warsaw, I think, to discuss it more intensively later with the Warsaw mechanism, it was very difficult to get consensus that there is a problem. And we are now advanced. Yes, there is a problem, and we have to address it appropriately, and that is what we are basically discussing in Sharm el-Sheikh. And what we did in the past is, for example, the Intro Resilience Initiative, and it was quite successful. Alone in 2021, we got 150 million people under protection, under insurance protection. But the most vulnerable countries rightly said this is not sufficient, it's not comprehensive, it does not address the full problem. So the Global Shield now tries to get this comprehensiveness, to arrange pre-cooked finance, not only through insurances, but also with regard to overall, for example, social security, social protection. So yeah, we developed it together with V20, so hopefully can feed into Jennifer's efforts to bring everybody together on one page on the loss and damage issue in Sharm el-Sheikh.
And for those of us who aren't that familiar with what Global Shields is, could you just give us a brief overview of exactly what it is and what it means for people?
Yeah, first of all, it's a country-by-country approach. So we have to look at the situations in the most vulnerable countries. Where are the needs? Where are the gaps? To ensure that finance is there right in time when a disaster happens, so that people will get a protection immediately on the spot, not going through a big bureaucracy. And these kind of assessments we want to start with right after Sharm el-Sheikh, to make it very concrete. And then we will see where do we need, for example, more investments in adaptation to limit or to reduce the amount of money to be provided through loss and damage mechanisms, and what kind of instruments are appropriate for the respective country. And then the finance, of course, has to be there with the World Bank or other MDBs, or the whole group of MDBs, and also with country-by-country support. So we are prepared for that. Once you kick off with such an idea, of course, you cannot look away when people ask you, and now what is about your part to finance it?
Okay, because that's a very important part of it, how it's going to be financed. But thanks for giving us a bit of clarification on that. But Patrizia, let's get your take on this issue. From your perspective at the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation, with your experience, what are your approaches and priorities for this field? The kind of preventative financing, climate resilience, limiting climate-related loss and damage, which is, what everyone's talking about at the moment. What are your perspectives on this issue?
From a Swiss perspective, from an agency for development and cooperation, we have, first of all, our ambition is to reunite positions within the government, so domestically, and then find partners and friends to leverage. So whatever we do, we try to put in a nail, hit on it, and anchor it as deep as we can on three fields. One is when we already failed, the humanitarian action. The second is when we work with partner countries bilaterally, and then on a multilateral scene. Maybe on the first one, on the humanitarian activities. I said it's when we already failed. It means we haven't managed to prevent it. And there we have an obligation to intervene. Switzerland has a long humanitarian tradition, the dispository state of the Geneva Conventions, host of many, many international organizations in Geneva with a humanitarian background. And we are very proud to have a core of humanitarian activists linked to the private sector that we can call upon when, with expertise. When the explosions in Lebanon happened, the floods for Pakistan, we can draw from the private sector expertise to leverage and to come into action. What we want when we do this, we want to have less humanitarian action in the future. Let me explain. People always laugh at me when I use the example of our construction efforts that we have with housing. We have a unit of very good architects that in Haiti, but also in Pakistan, have together with local people found a way to construct houses that they resist to earthquakes and to floods, that then can be built into government approaches. When we leave, there's no more need for international organizations to help in constructing this, because the people can't do this themselves. And that has proven a good approach. The floods in Pakistan, in the Swat Valley, where we went to have a look, proved that the houses still stand. After the earthquake in Haiti, the houses that we built before in 2010 still stood. So I think this is an approach to leverage and to find something, even in humanitarian action, that we have an obligation to see what can stay, what can local people with not a lot of resources still do to prevent further needs in this. The second is the partner countries. When we work bilaterally with different partners, we ask, what is the need? Is it air pollution? Is it working on the buildings? Is it in an agricultural sector? And when we design bilateral approaches, it's over years, between 60 and young bilateral partners are 10 years old. So it is a very long approach, often in areas and countries where people don't look anymore off the spotlight. And I think there it is also a responsibility, if we want to work on climate action, protecting populations, vulnerable populations, it's not going to be within 1 year in a country that is on the spotlight. That is definitely one of the issues, and work on regulations together with our economic partners to see what can attract also investment in climate resilient infrastructure and investment that we can bring to the partner countries with improving rules and regulations. And the third is the multilateral scene, working with partners and institutions. The IFIs were mentioned, where a lot of money is at stake, where we can work on decarbonization, when we can attract them to fragile states. The World Bank, the African Development Bank are examples where we are, of course, also in the boards and organizations where we are on the boards, that we make a difference there. And ultimately, in the Security Council, where it is more difficult, we imagine, for us to be there in the coming years, but also there try to bring it to that level and work it from different perspectives. And I think that is important, to have different lenses, different perspectives, and always try to find leverage and impact.
So a real call to action there. I mean, with your experience, extensive experience with the ICRC, you know more than most that we need prevention for both climate and conflict. How can those kinds of bridges be built to support preparedness for both of these issues? Because many people are fleeing not just climate, but also violent conflict too.
It's very often a mix of why people flee. And today, I think in the Horn of Africa, Sahel, maybe the Horn of Africa more, we have more climate displacement than conflict displacement. It's hard to tell, and the consequence on people is the same. They will end up in IDP camps, in villages. It's going to be difficult. What we have seen, where can we make an impact and what can we do? One is, when you talk about climate and displacement and conflict and displacement, you will have to make sure that the international humanitarian law is respected. Many of the issues of preventing access to areas hard to reach, when people cannot be benefiting from alerts, early alerts, when the government cannot provide the services, when other actors cannot get there, then of course it's more difficult for people to withdraw and sustain the shocks. What is also needed, and not sexy, is preventive action, prevention. Invest in prevention with communities. We have all been not all, but many of us have been to Istanbul when we talked about localization. We tend to forget that the first responders are always the local people, always. We all come later. So if we strengthen local authorities, local people in responding to crisis, we have saved lives and we have, of course, invested in the future. We work with partners that look at these issues. We invest in preventive action and also in insurance schemes. If you have the possibility when you possess either livestock or land and you grow crops and you're sure that you get a minimum of amount, or if there is a drought, your cattle, you get money back, then you have also the appetite to risk into further investing, to grow maybe your small enterprise. These are areas where investment is needed. Of course, also in the climate risk, anything that goes into climate risk reduction is an area where we invest most, because most of the people live in risky areas. Not all are conflict prone, but almost half of the world's population in one way or another risks climate impact sooner or later.
Thank you so much for that. So prevention obviously is the key. I mean, just if we can briefly come back to global shields, just wanted to sort of address some of the concerns that some people have been put forward, that perhaps global shields would focus more on disasters or dealing with disasters, but what about the slow onset problems like droughts, desertification, sea rises? Do you think that global shields could have an impact there as well?
Yeah, to be very clear and explicit on that, the Global Shield is not the 100% answer for all the loss and damage issues. I think it's a more comprehensive answer than anything we had before, and it's addressing disasters. And it is not addressing the slow changes, the slow onset. So we need to discuss this as well, of course. Also issues like cultural heritage, all these issues, the attacks, what it makes with societies. There are many dimensions, and I think that is something we will discuss, and it will not end in Sharm el-Sheikh, I think. And we have to find more answers, but still, as I said, if we get this climate shield on track, then we have a first step, and a very significant one. On the others we have to work, and that is something where, as also Patrizia addressed, the general development cooperation comes into place. I mean, we have to increase the resilience of society, specifically in the poorest countries, specifically in the most fragile countries, and there you need the whole set of instruments of development cooperation.
Jennifer, just over to you. I'm reducing the risk of climate-related conflicts. You have to address the root causes of those risks, of course, which are developmental, peace building, conflict-related, related to stabilization efforts. Now, some of these efforts are usually sit in the remit of foreign ministries. How can we facilitate cross-government actions to be able to deal with all of these cross-cutting issues?
Well, maybe to start with the root causes, because I think the root cause, there's different ones, the existing kind of development pathways, and certainly the extraction of fossil fuels. So if you're especially looking at major emitters, then you have to then, if you're looking at reducing conflict, there's many different pieces of the puzzle, but then, as Jochen was saying, you really do need to bring down emissions as quickly as possible and recognize kind of the root causes, and you can then look one step further into kind of the system that's perpetuating the use of fossil fuels and also unsustainable agriculture. And there's all kinds of different drivers there. But I think, first of all, particularly for the major economies, with developed countries, of course, taking the lead, and that's also across all of government approach that's needed. We need to have global emissions in the next 7 years. So I think that's one big issue coming up for the COP that's there. And then I think the other is indeed, the development paradigm in a way, and how actually it gets just continuing on the root causes piece of, how actually to build in the climate risks and others into the goals that are being set of government. So whether it be around water security or food security, that it's get a bit back to the data, but actually just really looking at, looking out, fighting for that 1.5 degree world, but having to plan, unfortunately, for something that's higher. And then to look at, what are the goals that are there of a country, and then developing the cross-governmental ministerial approach, I think. And I don't know, you can do it in very many different ways, I think. Here in Germany, we're trying out something that's a bit more informal, of getting the 4 ministries, this is just on international climate action, together around common goals and identifying those. I think if you're looking to implement, then having input from science on the data and the goals, the development goals that you have, taking into account the different potential impacts that are coming, and putting together action plans that are co-owned across those ministries, and optimally also have structures to bring in local communities. So, but you can't ignore it. You have to, I think everybody's so busy in each of their own fields, but you actually need to, I think, identify what are the goals that you're trying to achieve, which ministries do you then need, and then create whatever kind of structure is needed, continuing forward for that implementation. Including the foreign ministry, sure, but that's, I think, what we know is that so many of these root causes are much deeper than what just a foreign ministry can do. So that's why you have to have an all-government approach, or at least the ministries that are needed.
Thank you so much. I'm going to open up to the audience now. You have an opportunity to ask these 4 experts questions on this really important issue. And I think it's important that we get your questions and views into this as well. So do we have any questions from you?
Hi, thank you very much for the really inspiring discussion. My name is Grazia Pacillo from CGR Focus Climate Security. I have a question for Jennifer, if that's okay. More specifically, I would like to know about the concrete steps that the new initiative that was launched just yesterday will take into tackling the protection of the most vulnerable in the climate crisis and in the conflict crisis. And essentially, what are you thinking that how the climate security initiative will prepare for this type of activities, and what should we be looking for in the next months or so? Thank you.
Thanks for the question. I think the concrete next steps now are to get to work and identify, because the idea is to have country-driven, locally driven initiatives, projects, research that then can be shared, either of what is already happening to learn from, or what is needed. So yesterday, I know I had a number of conversations with governments of, what are the types of projects that are needed, to bring those together, and then to look at how to scale those up. So I think whether you're a research institution or a government or an NGO, et cetera, the next steps are really to bring those things together, and then to be looking across, and then to magnify those, and to bring them into the different governance bodies that deal with climate security topics. And I think the focus indeed, will be on the most vulnerable communities and countries that are there, and how we can be scaling up. But to use the analysis that's there, but really get into the project. So if there's a project in Iraq that's working really well, then to bring that in, to say, these are the components that are there, or here's something that we've learned from work that's happened thus far. This is what we'd like to do on the next level. Bring it into the group that's working together, and then see, how can we make something happen? So it's a bit of we want to build it together. So that's now it's kind of, everybody, we need your ideas and your projects that you're working on.
Thank you so much. Any other questions? The lights are so bright, I can't see hands.
I remember that from being on that side. It's much nicer on this side. Thank you very much for your comments. And I think in one of the roundtables that we had some quite provocative, honest discussions, and it would be great to continue that trend. So with WFP, as I mentioned earlier, we have covered thousands of farmers with microinsurance and now increasingly pastoralists. It's worth noting that the Swiss were the first to give us the funding to try out insurance for pastoralists, and we're very grateful that approach is now being scaled up. Internally, we have a lot of debates with people who say that insurance is for low-frequency, high-severity events, and that to do it right is so complicated in terms of getting delivery to the last mile and so on, that really we should be focusing on adaptation and at scale and getting funding for it at scale. We'd really welcome any thoughts from anyone at the panel as to what you really think. Is it really going to be able to scale up these quite complicated programs for impact, like the insurance, microinsurance, and so on? Are we underinvesting in adaptation because it's just so difficult to figure out what's going to give the impact that our donor partners tend to want quite quickly? Just any thoughts from anyone on that? Thank you.
Patrizia, would you like to take that? So focusing on adaptation, along with insurance, I guess, but changing the focus a little bit to focus more on adaptation.
I think there's not one way or the other. We don't have a choice. We have to try out different things, and we also have to not stop asking the people what they think is best for them, will be a challenge in the future. And I had this experience in Somalia a couple of years back. I was talking to a group of herders. They lost their camels and they were trying to farm next to a waterhole, more or less successfully, rather not. So I asked them, if we gave, what would you want? So they said, give us the camels back. And I asked, if we gave you the camels back, what would happen next? Do you think they would survive the next 5 years? And then a discussion started. And the result was actually, they thought, no. The camels will probably not survive if we have 100 camels again for over the next 5 years. What does this mean for communities? Not only insurance will not be enough, we will have to collectively prepare, like we have to prepare the planet probably, for what does this mean for us and for everyone else in the coming 5, 10, 50 years if the climate is changing. It will have more of a life and death impact on the most vulnerable, but it will have an impact on all of us. So it's very, very challenging, and I don't have any recipe for WFP or others, what exactly is it, but we have to prepare communities to become something else or to adapt differently. How? I don't have the answer.
Yeah, just from my perspective and my experience, it's interesting to note that the people I've spoken to in many parts of Somalia, in South Sudan, in Kenya, many of them, I think they would find it hard to make that decision, even to spend that money on insurance. It would be between buying a meal and buying insurance. And of course, they will buy that meal or they'll buy that food. But again, you know, as you said, I think insurance is important, but it has to come hand in hand with adaptation, climate adaptation, and building resilience for these future climate shocks. I don't know if you'd like to come in.
If I may, you have to have proof.
Yes.
I also have insurances. If they don't pay, I will stop having them. So it will be a proof. If my bike gets stolen, I want to have my bike repaired, replaced. And if I don't get that, I don't have trust in insurance. So it comes with trust. If I hear of a family that got back what they insured, then of course I'm inclined to also pay for it. So we have.
Do we have that time to build the trust with the multiple issues going on?
Yes, we work with African actors that actually do this, and the results are good. The question is, what do I do when I get my cattle back? How do I adapt further?
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I just want to underline, it's not to do the one and without doing the other. And I think if we run into the discussions in Sharm el-Sheikh saying, well, let's focus on adaptation instead of loss and damage, it will be a hard time there. So we need to have both addressed apart from mitigation. And I mean, it starts, yes, I agree, we need to do much more in adaptation, and it's doable. If you spoke about Pakistan, if you look at the flooding in Pakistan, and it's similar to what happened here on small scale, comparably small scale in Germany last year. It starts with urban planning. Where are people building their houses? And of course, you can reduce the losses and damages if you do the right planning. So we need adaptation plans. We need to do the investments. It will need sometimes harsh political decisions to implement it, but still there is at the end something we have to cover under the loss and damage regimes. And I know that insurances, there is some criticism. I mean, the easiest one is you caused the problem and now you want us to pay for insurances. But this is not the way how it works and how we look at it. Of course, we need to ensure that the insurances are financed properly, and we don't expect the people to do it that are affected to do it themselves. And on top of that, we need more. It's not only limited to insurances. Let's take the floodings, and you have small-scale farmers, and we have to make sure that there is a system in place that the farmers, the small-scale farmers, get immediately the seeds for next year, so that they immediately can get out of the disasters, or that they get new cattle. And we have the systems in some countries in Africa, in Pakistan, for example, already in place, and we have to extend it.
Thanks. I don't want to leave Maha out of the conversation. Just from the perspective of International Crisis Group, we look a lot at bringing political and conflict dimensions into account when we're looking at early warning and the risk of maladaptation. From your perspective, you're looking at Iraq and you're looking at all of these factors and the way they interplay together. How important is it to look at also the political dynamics when you're looking at early warning and early action?
Yeah, great question. I think our work there is also has a peace building dividend, because all these actors are in conflict. Of course, how can you implement an adaptation and mitigation project if the actors who are involved do not talk to each other or threatening each other, basically? So at the Planetary Security Initiative, which is led by the Click-and-Dall Institute, we set up this Basra Forum for Climate, Environment, and Security, where we basically bring all these different stakeholders who represent different political, ethnic, and sectarian backgrounds who do not necessarily talk to each other. We bring them around one table to discuss this, to use the climate change or climate security as an entry point for peace building. So this is our first approach. We try to do stabilization, mitigation, and dialogue among all these actors. And then we are paving the way for other development projects to be done on that sector. Yeah.
Thank you, Maha. Thank you very much. Any other questions from the audience? I can't see any hands. I have another question for you, Jennifer. Let's just come back to the fragile context. You just came back from a trip to East Africa and the Horn of Africa, where we're seeing a situation, particularly in Somalia, where people have been affected by this ongoing drought, the worst prolonged drought in 40 years, but also we're seeing conflict too. In Ethiopia, in Somalia, in the context of Al-Shabaab putting pressure and squeezing communities. When it comes to sort of early warning, early action in these more fragile contexts, what will your message be in Sharm el-Sheikh and at COP27? How will you bring the voices of the people living in these fragile contexts to COP and ensure that those voices are heard too?
I think it's essential that they're heard, first of all, and that we bring these different communities together. I think what I will be working on and trying maybe first in my role as German special envoy as part of the German government and the EU is to bring that urgency into the discussions about the global adaptation goal. Because I think, and to bring that context into that discussion more. Obviously, adaptation is different than hard peace-building efforts, but I think there's a conversation to be had there that I think needs to be deeper, and so I think that's one piece, and how to bring that local context into that. I think there's a big question about how. I mean, I think we have to get to the point where international financial institutions aren't counting how much they're doing on climate adaptation. Everything needs to be actually resilient with different temperature assessments or thinking of climate as you're developing your projects. So I think that's one piece, is to bring these trying to bring these different kind of communities together. I think the other is just as much as we can, the reality on the ground and why adaptation is key, mitigation is fundamental, but that we need a really systematic discussion about, from adaptation to loss and damage, all the way from prevention, to adaptation, to humanitarian, and then what comes after that. And that Germany and the European Union are very open to figuring that out with the most vulnerable countries that we've really heard, whether it's in the Horn of Africa or small island nations, that this is a here and now issue. This isn't something that's tomorrow, it's here and now. And I think the mood of the COP, I think, will be very much determined by how we're able to have that conversation. First of all, we have to have the conversation. We need to have an agenda item on loss and damage. I mean, my gosh, this is a topic that is here to stay forever. It's here forever now, unfortunately. And then to say, okay, how do we, Global Shield is there as part of it to get things moving, but how do we actually together build something that can increase the financing and the support both inside the UNFCCC and outside, and listen a lot, actually. And then, as one of the two co-facilitators, be trying to find those solutions on behalf of the Egyptian presidency. It's going to be a challenge, I think, and I think it's because the impacts are hitting so hard, because the impacts, of where you're working are so extreme. I just think the level of patience is very limited. I was in a meeting where one of the small islands said, we've been raising these issues for 20 years. And so, okay, excuse me if now you say you're open for an agenda item, I'm not jumping for joy. But we really need to get much more real about it. And I think that's the institutional structures. I think that's how different pieces fit together. It's certainly the financing question, which is very complex. And I think we need to be looking at everything we can, including ideas that we may not even be considering yet, on how to generate the support for these massive climate-induced disasters.
Yeah, I agree. There is a sense of weariness that we've been here so many times before, and will this COP bring about the implementation? I know the Egyptian government is saying it's going to be the COP of implementation, but will it really happen?
It has to be implementation, but we cannot forget ambition. We are heading towards 2.7 degrees Celsius. Think about what's happening today. And that's also maybe for the climate and security community to be thinking, okay, how can I connect my work into the discussion about decarbonizing and alternative development pathways? Then, and it needs to be on implementation on mitigation, it needs to be implementation on adaptation, it needs to be getting real implementation on loss and damage.
Fantastic. Just coming back to global shields as a potential solution among many solutions, what would you say would be the main challenges to get global shields off the ground? Other than financing, what could be the potential obstacles or challenges?
I think you spoke about the mood in Sharm el-Sheikh, and that is absolutely essential. If our colleagues and friends in the most vulnerable country gets the impression this global shield is just something to cook it as low as possible, then it will be difficult to get it through. If we can build trust that we are serious, that we want to look into the needs and that we are ready to provide the means to address these needs, I think then it can fly. And as I said earlier, and Jennifer echoed on that, we have to make very clear it's not limited to that. Our answer is not limited to the global shield. And I think then we can hope that we will find open ears and that we get into the discussion mode and, well, at the end can fix it. But again, as Jennifer said, it will not disappear. It will be there forever because the problem is there forever.
Yeah. And Patrizia, I hope you don't mind me coming back to you. I mean, with your extensive experience with the ICRC and with the impact of potential famine that we're approaching in Somalia, you know, we've had plenty of early warning about the droughts and about famine-like conditions and about insecurity and food insecurity, etc. And many people in East Africa would say leadership anyway, we say we've had the warnings, we've asked for the funding, and the difficulty has been that the world has been distracted with other conflicts in Europe, the issue in Afghanistan, etc., etc. When it comes to sort of early warning, early action, how do we transform that when we have such huge issues on the global stage right now? How can we focus in on these most pressing issues, for example, in the Horn of Africa?
Well, that's definitely not an easy question. I think one of the stark realities will be, in the coming month, there will not be much more public funding available for any region that faces a crisis right now. And it's very difficult to say that, but we have seen pressures from everywhere, talking to different countries as well, different development agencies, humanitarian actors. Everyone says the stage of the world today, if we have another crisis, and it has been there, it will be difficult to get additional funding for it. If we talk about Ethiopia and Somalia, the Horn of Africa, 30 years ago we had concepts that raised money to address the issues. We don't see this. The world is very much focused, at least in Europe, on the Ukraine war. That's a fact, it's very clear. And other countries tell us, please look beyond. We have to. And of course, climate action forces us to. It will be a tough moment for all of us. And how can we bring additional funding? Switzerland, for instance, we try, of course, it's still it's embryonic. We try to bring in the financial sector into the discussion on climate and security, at least mitigating the risks. Because the financial sector has seen generally that if you don't have climate security, you will not have a benefit globally. We have seen that in our neighborhood when the Rhine was low this summer. Cargo ships could no longer get up the Rhine and companies lost money. This is a language that talks to the financial sector, private sector, and it is where potentially money can be brought into on a global scale, but it's also not for tomorrow. So urgency for urgent action around the planet in the coming months, this will be extremely difficult, although we have had the early warning signs, although we have been alerted by the people, and although we have seen that the the areas at risk, the Horn and the Sahel and the Central Asia, have had climate problems in the past.
Yeah, I guess the problem is the financial sector are not big on risks. And I think, as you said, that changing the narrative slightly could potentially help. But at the same time, as the president of the ICRC recently said in a forum, that we have to be prepared to take more risks right now, especially when it comes to climate financing in fragile contexts. Just, Maha, maybe a closing thought from you, as somebody who works closely with local environmentalists, climate and security actors in Iraq through your Basra forum. Like, what would you say is the main thing that they're all looking for in terms of sort of early warning and early action? What concrete examples can you give of what they need on the ground?
Well, obviously funding, despite that the Iraqi government is making huge revenues now from their oil industry because of the war in Ukraine. We do not have government. This means there is no budget that is funding these smaller projects, but also there is no leadership or interest by the government to invest in these smaller projects in the affected communities. And I think this is where the role of the international community can come. We were there, we work with all these local actors, also from the local government, and they all say that there is a huge marginalization to the southern region of the Iraq. People live in isolation from the decision makers in Baghdad. So even if there is money, the decision makers do not see the problem as we see it on the ground over there. So I think what is needed now is financing for these environmentalists, academics, and civil society who's working in the south of Iraq. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And just a quick 30 seconds from you. Final thought? Yeah.
My goodness. Final thought. I think we have to think about radical collaboration. I think we have to consider how, the financial sector, actually, if it were to consider integrating risk really into their decisions, both on the impacts and on their investments, could have a major, just to respond on that piece. And I think we now have to do everything all at once. And that's extremely challenging because we've lost so much time. But I think there's so much know-how on the ground. It's how to take that and integrate it and then scale it up.
Thank you. And Johan, quick final thought.
Yeah, my goodness.
Let's try and end on a positive note.
Well, I think what is very essential, let me put this at a last point, this all has to be integrated in an overall comprehensive development cooperation policy. So if we just address climate change, we will fail if we not look at the full picture of all our SDGs. And we were already prior to the pandemic and to what we call the Russian war in Ukraine, not on track, far behind, but we were pushed back. And you will not reach our climate targets if we do not overcome inequality, if we don't overcome poverty, hunger, if we don't invest in education, if we don't ensure that women and girls are fully involved in the decision-making processes. So the full agenda is there, and unfortunately, we are not in the lucky position just to focus on one of the problems.
I'd like to thank our panelists for their great contributions to the discussion, also to you for your questions, and to those watching online. Thank you for joining us. Thank you very much.